Have you ever heard an empire crumble in a quarter of a second? It is terrifyingly quiet. Just the tap of an enter key. Entitled heirs think power lies in corner offices or $1,000 suits. They miss one cruel rule. True power belongs to the architect of the system. I let him build his delusion to the absolute peak, just to watch him realize his throne was wired with a time bomb from day one. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Maya Hughes. I am 34 years old. Currently, I am buried inside the mechanical guts of a heavy-duty rescue drone prototype, wearing thick protective coveralls completely smeared with dark machine oil. I am meticulously calibrating a complex circuit board down in the cavernous basement workshop of Vanguard Sentinel Corporation, a highly classified private defense technology conglomerate located in the heart of Austin, Texas. The air down here is heavy, thick with the metallic tang of hot solder, grinding steel, and the relentless hum of industrial ventilation systems. This is the real engine of the company, far away from the polished glass of the upper levels. Suddenly, the heavy reinforced steel doors at the far end of the floor slide open. The temperature in the room seems to drop as a jarring procession steps into the workshop. It is Julian Sterling. He is 28 years old and the newly minted Chief Executive Officer, having just seized the reins after his father suffered a sudden and fatal heart attack. Julian is leading a buzzing swarm of sycophantic assistants and nervous vice presidents. He strides across the scuffed concrete floor wearing a tailored Italian suit and, incredibly, a pair of plush velvet loafers. He literally wore velvet shoes into an active engineering laboratory. He dramatically waves a manicured hand in front of his face, loudly complaining to his entourage about the harsh ozone smell lingering from our plasma welding stations. His arrogant gaze sweeps across the busy room and eventually lands on me. He does not see an expert. He sees the grease stains on my cheeks, the frayed edges of my sleeves, and my dirty boots. His privileged mind instantly categorizes me as a lowly, disposable maintenance worker. He raises his hand and snaps his fingers. It is a sharp, demeaning sound that cuts right through the ambient noise of the machinery. "You there," Julian says, pointing a rigid finger directly at my chest. "Be useful for once and go fetch me an iced oat milk macchiato. And scrub your hands first. You look like you crawled straight out of a garbage incinerator." A few of the board members standing behind him chuckle, offering up a pathetic chorus of forced, cowardly amusement to please their new king. I do not flinch. I do not defend myself. I simply wipe my hands on a greasy shop rag, nod my head in silent obedience, and walk away to complete the mundane task. I keep my mouth firmly shut. I do not utter a single word about the reality of my position. I am the head of independent testing and quality assurance. I have poured 12 years of blood and sweat into this corporation, and I was the one and only trusted protege of the late founder. Julian is completely oblivious to the truth. He also knows absolutely nothing about my old, dented metal desk in the secure office down the hall. He does not know about the false bottom in the lowest drawer, and he certainly does not know about the document resting inside it. It is a master trust contract, bound and sealed with dark red wax, officially titled the Vanguard Guarantee. It is an impenetrable legal defense system, specifically engineered by his father and me to protect the lifeblood of this company against the lethal stupidity of a second-generation heir. After delivering his ridiculous coffee, I step back into the shadows of the testing bay. I pull a small, worn, leather-bound notebook from my chest pocket. I uncap my black pen and calmly record his very first violation. Day 1, 9:42 in the morning, misuse of key personnel, assessment, absolute failure to recognize the core structural integrity of this company. It took precisely 3 weeks for the rot to truly set in. Julian initiated a massive corporate restructuring, which was nothing more than a parasitic invasion of our ecosystem. He flooded our executive floors with a swarm of fast-talking, hollow-eyed consultants from Silicon Valley who had never held a soldering iron in their entire lives. They stood in front of digital whiteboards, throwing around useless buzzwords like aggressive synergy, paradigm shifts, and dynamic cost optimization. But their actual strategy was nothing short of systematic sabotage. During a terrifyingly brief strategy synchronization meeting, Julian mandated a catastrophic supply chain pivot. He ordered the immediate removal of our aerospace grade heat-resistant alloys from the rescue drone chassis production line. His brilliant alternative was a cheap, brittle, three-dimensional printed thermoplastic sourced from a shell vendor. Why? Because the consultants promised him it would inflate our profit margins to 40% right before the third quarter earnings report. It was a suicidal corporate maneuver. These specific drones were designed to fly directly into raging forest fires and active chemical disaster zones. Replacing titanium-laced alloys with cheap plastic meant our machines would literally melt mid-flight, dropping out of the sky when people needed them the most. I did not object. I did not raise my hand to argue with a boy who could not tell the difference between a thermal resistor and a tracking microchip. Instead, I stood quietly in the shadowed corners of the glass-walled conference rooms. Dressed in my faded coveralls, I was completely invisible to the men in tailored suits. I became a ghost haunting my own company. I calmly activated my concealed pocket recorder during every single presentation. I meticulously archived every intercepted email, every reckless digital signature, and every critical risk assessment report that Julian explicitly ordered his vice presidents to bury in the server trash. I was quietly building a heavily fortified vault of internal documents. Each file was a tangible piece of ammunition, detailing how these aggressive cost-cutting decisions were not just unethical, but actively guaranteeing fatal consequences for the emergency responders who relied on our defensive technology. The absolute climax of his unearned arrogance arrived on a Thursday evening. Julian had just closed a meaningless brand franchising contract, an absolute joke of a deal that licensed our prestigious corporate logo to a mass-market consumer battery manufacturer. To celebrate this hollow, ego-driven victory, he threw a lavish, unapproved champagne reception. He did not host it in the executive dining hall. He hosted it right in the middle of our Class A sterile testing laboratory. Drunken, wealthy executives stumbled blindly around highly sensitive engineering equipment, spilling expensive vintage alcohol over pristine, static-free workstations. By midnight, the inevitable happened. A knocked-over ice sculpture and a shattered magnum of champagne short-circuited the main power supply of our micro-calibration machine array. That specific piece of hardware was worth exactly $2 million. It was the only machine on the continent capable of perfectly balancing our gyroscopic flight sensors, and Julian effectively destroyed it for a ridiculous photo opportunity. The next morning, the laboratory smelled intensely of stale alcohol and impending disaster. Julian stormed onto the floor, refusing to accept even a single ounce of responsibility for the carnage. He needed a scapegoat to offer the board of directors, and he found an easy target in Marcus. Marcus was our most dedicated floor foreman, a man who regularly pulled 12-hour shifts to keep the assembly lines running smoothly. His wife was heavily pregnant with their first child. Marcus made the fatal, honorable mistake of stepping forward and strictly refusing to let his highly trained diagnostic technicians act as glorified janitors to sweep up the sticky, glass-covered wreckage of Julian's pathetic party. Julian fired him right on the spot. He screamed insults an inch from Marcus's face, violently stripped him of his corporate security badge, and loudly ordered him escorted off the premises by armed guards before the afternoon. It was a sickening, visceral display of inherited power mindlessly crushing honest, hard-working labor. I stood frozen by the welding station, watching Marcus pack his diagnostic tools with trembling hands. As soon as the floor cleared for the lunch shift, I accessed my private, heavily encrypted banking terminal. Without a second thought, I silently transferred exactly 6 months of my own accumulated salary directly into Marcus's checking account to keep his growing family afloat. Then, I pulled my worn leather notebook from my chest pocket. I clicked my pen. deliberately opting for the stark red ink this time. I wrote the new entry with absolute cold precision. Day 21, Level 1 Safety Standard Violation, Persecution of Key Personnel. I closed the notebook and walked quietly down the hall into a secure, soundproof server maintenance closet. I pulled out an untraceable satellite phone. I dialed a heavily guarded number belonging to a trusted, offshore legal firm that helped draft the original founding documents. The encrypted connection clicked open. The call lasted exactly 10 seconds. "Prepare to initiate the protocol," I whispered into the cold receiver. "I am gathering the firewood. It is almost time to light the match." The email arrived with a high-priority red flag flashing aggressively on my terminal screen. It was a direct mandate from the executive suite, bypassing all standard operational protocols. Julian was ordering me to digitally forge the final quality assurance certificates for our newest fleet of high-altitude Border Patrol drones. The shipment was rigidly scheduled to leave the loading dock by the end of the week. There was a glaring, fatal flaw he was choosing to completely ignore. Our rigorous thermal endurance tests proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the newly installed, cheaper propulsion systems would violently combust if operated continuously for over 2 hours in severe desert climates. These autonomous machines were specifically designed to hover over remote, arid terrain, tracking lost civilians and monitoring national security threats. If their engines caught fire at 3,000 feet, burning shrapnel would rain down directly onto the very people they were supposed to protect. It was a definitive line I absolutely could not cross. I stood up from my dented metal desk. I did not bother to put on a corporate suit. I kept my oil-stained coveralls on and rode the private executive elevator all the way up to the 40th floor. The ascent was silent, a physical transition from the gritty reality of the workshop to the delusional heights of executive power. The elevator doors slid open to reveal a sprawling, sterile penthouse suite entirely encased in floor-to-ceiling smart glass. The air up here was thin, artificially chilled, and reeking of expensive cologne and misplaced authority. Julian sat lazily behind an enormous desk carved from a single seamless slab of imported black marble. Casually flicking a solid gold pen between his manicured fingers, I stepped right into the center of the vast room. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind me, sealing us in a vacuum of corporate tension. For the first time since he took over the company, I let the protective mask of the submissive, obedient floor worker slide completely off my face. I stood tall, my posture rigid, authoritative, and unyielding. "I am not signing off on the Border Patrol fleet," I stated, my voice echoing sharply against the cold glass panes. "The endurance parameters are catastrophically flawed. The engines will overheat and detonate after exactly 2 hours of continuous flight. You are intentionally putting lethal hazards into the sky. Human lives and the foundational legacy of this corporation are resting directly on the integrity of those machines. I will not authorize a massacre for a profit margin." Julian stopped flicking his gold pen. He leaned back in his plush leather chair and let out a loud, grating burst of laughter. It was a hollow, ugly sound that bounced erratically off the polished marble walls. He grabbed the thick technical file resting on his desk and violently hurled it directly at my chest. The heavy binder hit the floor with a loud crack, scattering highly confidential schematic papers across the pristine tiles. "Legacy," Julian sneered, shaking his head as if he were talking to a deeply naive child. "Legacy is a pathetic bedtime story invented for poor people, so they feel slightly better about dying with absolutely nothing in their bank accounts. I do not care about some imaginary corporate soul. The only thing I care about is artificially inflating the stock price by the end of this quarter. I am dumping this entire rusted scrapyard onto a foreign conglomerate next month, and I am walking away with enough liquid capital to buy my own private island. I am not letting a delusional grease monkey halt my exit strategy over a few overheated engines." He opened a thin silver drawer, pulled out a crisp white envelope, and tossed it carelessly across the expansive marble surface toward me. It landed near the edge of the desk. "There is a certified check for $500,000 inside that envelope," Julian said. his tone dripping with absolute condescension and unearned superiority. Consider it a lubrication fee for your rusted morals. Cash it. Buy yourself a house that does not have wheels on it. Go downstairs. Sign the clearance forms. Shut your mouth. And pretend you never saw the thermal data. Everyone has a price. And I am entirely sure $500,000 is more money than your entire bloodline has ever seen in one single place. He was looking at me like I was a cheap, disposable commodity, someone who could be easily bought and silenced with his loose pocket change. The sheer audacity of his ignorance was almost suffocating. He actually believed he held all the cards, entirely blind to the trap he was standing in. I did not reach for the envelope. I did not even glance at the money. I kept my eyes firmly locked onto his, staring at him with the cold, hollow intensity of an executioner examining a walking corpse. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and dense, until the smug, arrogant smirk slowly began to fade from his face, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. "You just signed your own death warrant, Julian," I said softly, my voice completely devoid of any emotion or hesitation. I turned on my heel and walked out of the glass office, leaving his pathetic bribe sitting untouched on the black marble desk. Late that evening, when the massive manufacturing facility was submerged in total darkness and the bustling floors were empty, I sat alone in front of my secure terminal in the basement. Only the harsh blue light of the dual monitors illuminated the small room. I opened the deeply encrypted command prompt hidden within the mainframe. I rapidly typed in a complex sequence of alphanumeric keystrokes, seamlessly bypassing every single administrative firewall on the corporate network. With one final, deliberate press of the Enter key, I activated Phase 1 of the Trust Protocol. In a fraction of a second, I silently froze all executive access to the foundational source code of our most critical military defense projects. It was a total digital lockdown, executed flawlessly without leaving a single trace of evidence or an alert on the primary servers. The trap was officially armed, and the countdown had begun. The morning sun had barely breached the horizon when a heavy convoy of armored black sports utility vehicles rolled onto the pristine tarmac of the Vanguard testing facility. It was the official inspection day. A highly classified, elite delegation from the United States Department of Defense had arrived to physically evaluate the new fleet of high-altitude Border Patrol drones. The massive hangar doors were rolled wide open, flooding the expansive industrial space with harsh, blinding natural light. Julian was standing front and center on a temporary staging platform. He was wearing a shimmering, custom-tailored midnight blue silk suit that looked utterly ridiculous against the gritty backdrop of heavy cranes and steel scaffolding. He was aggressively hovering around a tight group of decorated four-star generals and stern, unsmiling procurement officers. He was flashing his incredibly expensive, perfectly bleached teeth and sweating profusely under the industrial lights as he delivered a heavily rehearsed, hollow monologue. He threw around empty, meaningless corporate buzzwords about disruptive innovation, tactical synergy, and next-generation defense paradigms. He was desperately trying to blind the military experts with charisma so they would not look too closely at the actual hardware. The massive drones sat poised ominously on the launch rails directly behind him, gleaming under the bright floodlights, completely unaware that their internal engines were effectively ticking time bombs. I did not wait for him to reach his grand dramatic finale. I emerged from the dark shadows of the secondary maintenance corridor. I was wearing my heavy, thick, oil-stained canvas coveralls and scuffed steel-toed boots. The heavy, rhythmic thud of my footsteps echoed sharply across the cavernous concrete floor, cutting right through Julian's slick, manufactured presentation like a jagged knife. The generals immediately turned their heads, their sharp, highly trained eyes instantly assessing the sudden, unorthodox intrusion. Julian froze right in the middle of a sentence. His jaw dropped open as he saw me marching directly toward the primary master control console. He frantically tried to wave me away with a sharp, aggressive flick of his wrist, masking his sudden panic with a tight, nervous, high-pitched laugh. He hissed under his breath, violently gesturing for me to get off the floor immediately. I completely ignored his existence, I walked straight past the intimidating group of high-ranking military officials. I stepped confidently up to the massive steel control terminal, raised my hand, and slammed my palm down hard on the heavy, red emergency lockdown button. A loud mechanical klaxon wailed briefly, a piercing sound that shattered the professional atmosphere, before an automated digital voice echoed loudly through the entire hangar, formally confirming that the launch mechanisms were now completely disabled. The giant digital diagnostic displays mounted on the walls behind the drones instantly flashed a bright, blinding warning yellow. The entire massive hangar suddenly descended into a thick, suffocating, dead silence. Julian stepped forward, his face rapidly flushing a deep, ugly crimson. Before he could scream for his armed security detail to physically drag me away, I turned my back to him. I addressed the formidable military delegation directly. I spoke with absolute, unwavering, ironclad authority. My voice rang out clear, cold, and incredibly loud across the silent facility. "Generals, gentlemen," I stated boldly, maintaining intense, direct eye contact with the highest-ranking officer standing in the center of the group. "My name is Maya Hughes. I am the head of independent testing and quality assurance for this entire corporation. I have officially locked the launch grid. I am standing here today to formally declare that this entire multi-million-dollar shipment of drones is absolute, catastrophic garbage. They represent a severe, immediate, and lethal threat to national security and human life. The thermal endurance parameters have been intentionally and maliciously falsified. If you deploy these specific units to the southern border, their propulsion systems will critically overheat and violently detonate after exactly 2 hours of continuous flight. You will have flaming toxic shrapnel raining down directly onto your own patrol officers. The internal engineering schematics proving this fatal structural flaw were deliberately suppressed and hidden by the executive suite in a desperate, reckless attempt to cut manufacturing costs by 40%. The generals immediately exchanged dark, furious, and highly dangerous glances. The atmosphere in the room instantly turned incredibly lethal. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian completely snapped. The polished, sophisticated, wealthy veneer of the young chief executive officer shattered into a million jagged pieces right then and there. Absolute, unhinged, animalistic rage violently overtook his entirely fragile mind. He lost complete control of his basic sanity right in front of the single most powerful and important clients on the face of the earth. He lunged forward clumsily, his face contorted into an ugly, hateful, demonic snarl. Thick blue veins bulged violently against the tight white collar of his expensive silk shirt. "Shut your damn mouth!" Julian screamed at the absolute top of his lungs, his voice cracking violently with pure, uncontrolled hysteria. Saliva flew from his lips as he pointed a trembling, accusing finger directly at my face. "You are absolutely nothing. You are a pathetic, dirty, uneducated little wrench monkey. You are a disgusting rat crawling around in the sewer of my factory. How dare you stand there and lie to these men? You have zero authority here. I own you. I own the very ground you are standing on." His screaming was so incredibly chaotic, so violently unprofessional, and so deeply unhinged that two of the military aides instinctively reached into their jackets, resting their hands on their holstered weapons. Simultaneously, several other shocked executives and lower-level technicians pulled out their cellular phones, hitting the record button to capture the catastrophic, historic meltdown in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. I stood perfectly still, letting his toxic, classist venom wash right over me like water off a stone. I waited. I counted exactly 3 seconds in my head. I waited until I was absolutely, flawlessly certain that the blinking red lights of the recording cell phones and the high-definition overhead security cameras were actively capturing every single frame and every single audio wave of this confrontation. I needed his exact words forever immortalized in the permanent digital record, when the timing was absolutely, mathematically flawless. I tilted my head slightly to the left and asked a very specific, heavily calculated, and legally loaded question. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm, perfectly level, and incredibly clear. What exact authority are you currently using to physically override and manually interfere with the supreme, established safety protocols of this corporation? He lunged right into the gaping jaws of the trap without a single, solitary second of hesitation. The bait was simply too sweet, too perfectly tailored for his massive, incredibly fragile ego to resist. By the absolute authority of the man who owns this entire damn network, Julian roared furiously, his desperate voice echoing violently off the high steel ceiling. By the supreme authority of the sole heir and the chief executive officer, you are fired. You are completely and entirely terminated immediately. Get out of my building right now. Get the hell out of my company. The explosive words hung heavily in the air. It was a fatal, irreversible, legally binding declaration, executed loudly and proudly in front of a dozen highly credible federal witnesses. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not show even a microscopic ounce of fear or intimidation. Instead, I smiled. It was a slow, incredibly radiant, and strangely terrifying smile that reached completely past my eyes. It was a smile so deeply unnerving, so completely devoid of the panic he expected, that Julian actually stumbled a half-step backward. A sudden, involuntary shiver visibly raced down his spine as a cold, sharp flicker of primal dread finally pierced through his blinding arrogance. He suddenly realized something was horribly, terribly wrong, but he had no idea what it was. I reached up to the thick canvas collar of my heavy coveralls. I deliberately unclipped my solid steel employee identification badge. I held it out in front of me for a brief, agonizing second before casually opening my fingers and dropping it. It hit the solid concrete floor with a sharp, incredibly resonant, and final clink. I have been waiting to hear those exact words for the past 3 months, I said, my voice dripping with cold, absolute, and merciless satisfaction. Thank you for your complete cooperation, Julian. Julian marched out of the massive testing hangar with his chest aggressively puffed out. Deeply and foolishly convinced he had just achieved a massive, undeniable victory. He truly believed he had permanently crushed a pathetic, insignificant rebellion. He quickly adjusted the collar of his expensive silk tie, completely ignoring the stunned silence of the military delegation he left behind, and headed straight back to the main executive tower. He was eager to officially finalize the paperwork for the corporate sale and secure his massive payout. He walked up to the private VIP elevator, the one explicitly and exclusively reserved for the chief executive officer. He pulled out his heavy platinum access card and confidently swiped it across the sleek digital reader. Instead of the usual soft, welcoming chime and the smooth, silent slide of the polished steel doors, the scanner emitted a harsh, angry, buzzing error tone. The bright LED indicator flashed a solid, blinding red. Access denied. He frowned, muttered a bitter curse under his breath, and swiped it again. Much slower this time. Red. He swiped it a third time, slamming the plastic violently against the machine. Red. Assuming it was merely a temporary system glitch caused by the massive network lockdown I had initiated earlier, he angrily stormed over to the standard employee elevator. He was forced to ride it up alongside 2 terrified junior accountants, his mood rapidly souring into a toxic brew of impatience and irritation. He barged aggressively into his primary, glass-walled conference room, where 2 high-level foreign acquisition partners were already waiting patiently. He immediately tried to smooth things over, masking his frantic energy with a fake, wide smile, and attempted to order a wildly expensive, fully catered lunch from the city's most exclusive restaurant. He pulled out his solid black corporate credit card to authorize the massive transaction over the phone. The digital terminal on the other end instantly rejected it. The catering manager, sounding highly confused, nervously informed him that the card had been officially declined due to a complete institutional freeze. A sharp, icy spike of genuine panic finally began to claw at the edges of Julian's mind. He rushed over to his primary laptop positioned at the head of the long mahogany conference table, intending to quickly check his internal banking portals and bypass the block. The screen was completely pitch black. A single line of stark, white text sat perfectly in the dead center of the monitor. It read, "Network privileges permanently revoked. User accounts critically suspended." He frantically grabbed his cellular phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed his personal wealth manager to check his private offshore trust funds. The automated voice on the other end of the line calmly informed him that every single financial asset bearing his legal name was currently locked under a severe federal and corporate legal freeze. His massive fortune was entirely inaccessible. Before he could even begin to process the sheer magnitude of the impending disaster, the heavy double-glass doors of the conference room swung open. In walked Elena. She was the chief legal officer of Vanguard Sentinel Corporation, a terrifyingly sharp, unapologetic, and brilliant woman made entirely of iron and intellect. She was flanked tightly by 4 heavily armed, broad-shouldered tactical security contractors. They were the exact same security personnel Julian had repeatedly and loudly treated like disposable, uneducated garbage over the past 3 weeks. Elena did not greet him. She did not offer a polite, professional smile. She walked methodically to the opposite end of the long mahogany table, her high heels clicking ominously against the polished hardwood floor. She carried a thick, ancient-looking leather-bound folder sealed with a heavy stamp of dark red wax. She lifted it and let it drop squarely onto the table. It hit the wood with a heavy, resonant, and incredibly final thud that seemed to echo menacingly through the entire room. "Julian," Elena said, her voice completely devoid of any warmth, hesitation, or sympathy. "Exactly 22 minutes ago, in front of multiple federal witnesses, you explicitly and violently terminated the employment of the head of independent testing. You did so immediately after she activated an emergency safety lockdown to prevent the distribution of lethally defective hardware." Julian gripped the smooth edge of the table, his knuckles turning completely white as his breathing quickened. "I am the chief executive officer. I own this entire building. I can fire whoever the hell I want, whenever I want." "You were the chief executive officer," Elena corrected him smoothly, her tone razor-sharp and absolutely unyielding. She reached out with perfectly manicured fingers and broke the thick red wax seal on the folder, flipping it open to reveal the highly complex, densely printed legal documents inside. "This document is the Vanguard Guarantee. It is a highly classified, irrevocable trust covenant drafted entirely and secretly by your late father before his death. It contains a very specific, completely unbreakable protocol, firing the officially designated secret key holder for reasons directly related to protecting product safety, without first securing 100% unanimous consent from the entire board of directors, is legally classified as an act of absolute corporate treason against the foundational legacy of this company." Julian stared at her, his perfectly styled hair now slightly disheveled, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and utter confusion. "Secret key holder? What are you even talking about? She is a dirty mechanic. She is a nobody." "She is Maya Hughes," Elena stated coldly, her eyes locking onto his with terrifying, predatory intensity. "She is not a mechanic. She is the supreme trustee of the Vanguard Sentinel Corporation. Your father knew you were impulsive, greedy, and fundamentally incompetent. He deeply feared you would systematically destroy his entire life's work for a quick, thoughtless payout. So, he legally transferred exactly 51% of the ultimate, overriding veto power into a deeply hidden blind trust, heavily guarded and controlled exclusively by Maya. She has quietly held the ultimate majority power over this entire global empire for over a decade, and by firing her in a desperate, pathetic attempt to cover up your own catastrophic safety violations, you have manually triggered the irrevocable disinheritance clause." Julian's legs physically gave out beneath him. He collapsed backward into his plush leather chair, his mouth opening and closing rapidly without producing a single sound, like a fish pulled out of the ocean. The 2 foreign acquisition partners slowly stood up, quietly gathered their expensive briefcases without saying a word, and swiftly exited the room. fully realizing the multi-million-dollar deal was utterly dead and buried. Elena gestured coldly to the armed guard standing by the door. The disinheritance clause permanently strips you of all corporate titles, all salary, all unvested stock options, and all access to company funds, effective immediately. You currently own absolutely nothing. The lead security officer, a massive, scarred military veteran whom Julian had loudly cursed out just 3 days prior, stepped forward. He did not look at Julian with any respect. He looked at him like a pathetic trespasser. "Stand up," the guard ordered, his voice incredibly deep, rough, and uncompromising. "You need to hand over the corporate cellular phone, the platinum access keys, and that solid gold Rolex you purchased using the company expense account." Julian was shaking uncontrollably. Tears of pure shock, utter defeat, and absolute humiliation welled up in his eyes as he clumsily unbuckled the heavy gold watch from his trembling wrist and pushed it across the table. He handed over his phone. He handed over his designer wallet containing the now entirely useless black cards. "Now," the guard continued, pointing a thick, calloused finger toward the small back exit of the executive floor, "you are permanently banned from utilizing the elevators. You are going to leave this building by walking down 40 flights of concrete stairs. Do not make us physically drag you out of here." Julian was a broken, completely empty shell. He stood up slowly, permanently stripped of his title, his unearned wealth, and his false power, and began the long, agonizing, and intensely humiliating descent into absolute ruin. Julian completely refused to accept his sudden banishment, driven by pure, toxic desperation and the terrifying reality of losing his extravagant, unearned lifestyle. He spent the next 72 hours frantically searching for a way back into the fortress. He hired a shadow team of aggressive, backdoor corporate attorneys, and they eventually found a microscopic, heavily buried legal loophole. His private stock inheritance could not be instantly and permanently dissolved if he successfully called an emergency shareholder meeting and secured a 100% vote of no confidence against the current board of directors. To execute a hostile takeover of that massive magnitude, he needed an enormous amount of liquid capital to buy out the swing votes and aggressively force a total company liquidation. Stripped of his bank accounts and completely cut off from legitimate financial institutions, he turned to the absolute darkest, most dangerous corners of the city. He borrowed $15 million in highly illegal, predatory cash loans from a ruthless underground criminal syndicate. Armed with that dirty money, he confidently partnered with our biggest, most vicious competitor, a cutthroat private equity hedge fund known as Obsidian Capital, an organization utterly famous for dismantling tech corporations piece by piece. The morning of the emergency shareholder meeting finally arrived. The grand boardroom on the top floor was packed tight with nervous executives and confused institutional investors. I sat calmly at the very head of the long mahogany table, entirely relaxed in the heavy leather chair traditionally reserved for the chairman. The heavy double doors violently swung open. Julian marched in, completely intoxicated by his own resurrected arrogance. He was flanked by his expensive new lawyers, waving a thick, court-mandated proxy order in the air like a conquering general holding a flag of victory. He looked at the security guards who had thrown him out just days prior with absolute venom in his eyes. "You honestly thought you could outsmart me," Julian sneered, slamming the massive stack of legal documents onto the table right in front of me. The loud smack echoed sharply across the silent room. "I just forced a hostile takeover. I legally aligned with Obsidian Capital. I have the proxy votes. I am liquidating this entire company today, and I am personally ensuring that you go to federal prison for corporate theft and gross insubordination." I did not blink. I did not move an inch from my seat. I simply picked up a small black remote from the table and pressed a single button. The massive digital projector screen descended slowly behind me, immediately illuminating the darkened room with the exact, highly confidential sale contract Julian had just proudly signed with Obsidian Capital. I looked up at him, my expression completely hollow, completely devoid of any mercy or hesitation. You really should have rigorously investigated the foundational ownership structure of your new partners, I said quietly, my voice cutting through the heavy tension like a surgical blade. It is not a rival hedge fund, Julian. It is a highly classified, completely empty shell company. Your father and I legally incorporated it exactly 5 years ago. It was explicitly designed to serve as one final, ultimate loyalty test in the absolute worst-case scenario. Julian froze completely. The color instantly began to drain from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. By actively colluding with what you firmly believe to be a hostile foreign entity to systematically dismantle our classified military contracts, I continued, standing up slowly from the chairman's seat. You did not just violate your inheritance clauses. You formally and legally committed textbook, Level 1 industrial espionage against a United States defense contractor. You have 0 shares. You have absolutely 0 leverage. You now owe $15 million to a violent criminal syndicate that will absolutely hunt you down. And you have just handed the federal government a perfectly documented, legally binding confession of treason. The absolute reality of his situation crashed down on his fragile mind like a collapsing skyscraper. His knees physically buckled. He dropped heavily to the floor right in front of the entire board of directors. The arrogant, untouchable Heir completely vanished, instantly replaced by a sobbing, pathetic, broken boy. He crawled on his knees across the expensive carpet, desperately clutching the bottom edge of my suit jacket. "Please," he begged, tears and saliva violently streaming down his face in a miserable display. "Please, Maya, I will do anything. Let me clean the floors. Make me a janitor. Just let me stay here. Please do not let them take me away to prison." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, necessary, and deeply satisfying finality. I refused his pathetic plea with a silent, dismissive shake of my head. I pulled my jacket from his grip, raised my hand, and signaled toward the hallway. 6 Federal Bureau of Investigation agents, dressed in heavy tactical gear and windbreakers, stepped out of the shadows of the antechamber. They grabbed Julian by his arms, violently pulled his hands behind his back, and locked heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. His desperate, agonizing screams echoed all the way down the glass hallway as they dragged him into the elevator. The very next morning, the sun rose over a completely restored empire. I was back down in the cavernous basement workshop, wearing my thick protective coveralls, once again comfortably smeared with dark machine oil. The massive industrial ventilation systems hummed with beautiful, productive life. I walked over to the main diagnostic station, picked up a heavy steel wrench, and looked across the busy factory floor. Marcus was standing there, fully reinstated, holding his diagnostic tools and smiling warmly at me. The true order of the system had finally returned. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Boss Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.